Now, some people felt a little thrown in at the deep end this time with Mark TV. And of course, you had the option to take it whichever way you wanted to go. And so we had some basic successes with just taking the elements as they were and using the different channels in pretty simple ways to get a composite. Here's one example. So things that are working here include the reflections, which if we just look at those passes, they are here with their own very well articulated mask, but it doesn't have to be animated because it's a 3D layer that is being animated by the camera. So that works really well. And the look of these things is achieved, if we look at the pre-comp, with pretty simple means: hue and saturation and some levels. And we've got a few different passes here. And there was an attempt on these multiply modes to use an extract effect, but it's above the extractor effect that's giving us the ambient occlusion layer in this case. And this particular one is giving us a matte line. So I had warned against this. Multiply, the way it works in this case, can do that. And the simple fix is just to take any of these layers. So I'll just duplicate this one, move it to the top. Just to be clean about it, I'm also going to say remove all the effects and switch it to stencil alpha. So that, again, if it didn't stand out, is the big missing workaround to that preset EXR structure that I showed you how to use. But in this case, this student was just going straight in and choosing the passes as desired. So if I solo this layer, let's just see, and turn off specular here, we have in each case the default. And it's a slightly odd thing that was done here to put the extractor effect at the bottom because, of course, it cancels out all the effects above it. But I think that the reason for that is just what happens when you duplicate a layer. So in other words, the student started with main creature, and this was the one that got all of these effects, and then none of the ones you see on the other layers apply. And that happens all the time, either deliberately or inadvertently. I think in this case it was inadvertent. The only reason not to do that, besides that you're making After Effects do extra work, although these effects don't demand a lot of processor time. But of course, it is something that someone else, me in this case, has to figure out what the heck you were doing. So essentially, we have these other passes applied with blending modes, and if we look a little closer, there's no particular opacity or anything else, at least not in this case, and that mask is turned off. So there are some things that don't need to be in these layers, and really the speck and reflection are adds, and the ambient occlusion and shadow are multiplies. It's very straightforward. Let's just see if there's even any opacity adjustment just on the shadow layer that's been dialed back. So this is a very simple, straightforward use of the multiple passes, and I think it works well. I really like the color choice, and I like the way this looks with this blur that was already in there at the end. It looks really cool through here. Just revisiting the pre-comp where all of the multi-pass work was done here, there's a couple other things that are a little confusing, so I just wanted to clarify. The whole pre-comp is called Beauty Pass. The Beauty Pass is effectively when you just get one render, that's what you get usually. So if somebody just gave you a 3D render and they only gave you one pass, that's effectively the Beauty Pass. That also can be the diffuse pass. So the diffuse pass is the one that we saw with no effects on it. So if we took one of these layers, soloed it, and turned off all the effects, that is how the element started out looking, and that's just basically lit, and so the diffusion of the light is what we're seeing there. So I'll unsolo that and turn the effects back on. What the heck? There we go. And so the things that are being done right here are shadow and ambient occlusion passes. Those are the ones that darken things down. So multiply is good for that. The one problem we ran into was that matte edge that we saw if we don't add the layer with a stencil alpha over the whole thing. And that's just a flaw, again, of the EXR setup in After Effects. Now, I'm not sure exactly what these masks are doing here, but they're hidden by the logo in this case. This does seem like a case where one also wants to see what other channels would let you get a selection. So you don't have to do as many holdout masks. But in any case, reflection and specular using add mode for those is perfectly fine. Other modes that lighten things up are screen, lighten, and I stay away from the dodge ones here. So those are pretty much the ones you're going to be using for things that are adding a bit of color and light. Here is another basically successful example with only slight variations on the same approach. It really does feel like the creature should appear where it says creature activates, but there's no right and wrong here. And this color that we're getting in this case was not the result of a color adjustment so much as finding layers that had other shades in them. So in this case, the diffuse layer that's in here was applied using Extractor, and it's got a little blur on it. But if we just look at the layer itself, it's got a lot of this brighter yellow, pink, orangey kind of thing going on. And it's added on, so it's brightening that part of the spectrum. So again, we've got ambient occlusion and shadow passes going on here. The reflections in this case are applied with soft light. A lot of these blending modes really are down to what is looking and feeling right to you. So even though add and multiply are the ones I advocate for kind of traditional multipass compositing, some of these others will often work really well. And you've seen me in the past kind of call out some of the blending modes that I think are the ones you're most likely going to use. The main ones that I tend to avoid are these kind of ones that end in light, and the ones that end in dodge, which really are more kind of set up for, well, print, really. But heck, you're motion graphics artists, you may find that you can break the rules and get away with it. In this case, we don't have any pre-comping going on, which, is okay because this is still a pretty well-organized comp. So, of course, you got to pick your shot, and in this case, the beach was chosen. Let's take a look. So I really like the character design in this case that was done with the multiple passes, getting this glowing thing happening. That's a great example of something that sounds hard to do in 3D and in 2D was just a question of, in the pre-comp, going in and creating a layer that would light it up like that. One thing I want to call out here is the shadow, because I think that the student in this case got into a little bit of a fight here with this shadow layer. So I'm just going to solo this layer for a second, and we've got a few effects applied on here. Let's just turn those off and see what we started with. So there's kind of a gray solid and then shadows being cast on it. So it's a shadow catcher. And then the reason there's a mask is there were these extra versions of the character back there. So in order not to have to deal with them, the student decided to mask them out, which took some actual keyframed roto, and that was done in the main shot as well, looks like. And then there's some effects here. There's an extract effect, which is basically hardening the shadow. Let's see, let me unsolo it. So even if we look at it like this, I think that's more what we were after. That is the way the shadow pass came in and how it was meant to look. And there's an extract plus a blur. Oh, I don't have these turned on. That's why I'm not seeing them. Let's turn on the layer effect. Okay, so that's getting crushed by the extract. And then there's sort of bringing it back with a blur and multiplying the whole thing. And I don't know what this invert is really doing. And that's why I think there was a bit of a fight going on here. So try not to fight your elements when you've got some nice subtlety in them. And in this case also, this is where I would use an adjustment rather than a blending mode, as you saw me do in the warehouse. So what I'm going to do here is just delete these effects. And again, like I said already, that looks kind of good with a multiply. Another way I could do it, though, to just get a little more definition of what's going on between the wet and dry sand, is to add an adjustment layer. And let's just look at this shadow pass for a second again. So I want the darker areas but not the sky. So this is a case where I would actually invert this thing. And I inverted the wrong layer. There. So now I have just the shadow areas held out. Alright, so let's see what happens if we unsolo that, turn it off, and use it as an adjustment layer. So that is going to be Illumimat. And now we'll just add a curves control. And we can either come down just on the top level, which is giving us an effect a lot like what we had, or we can combine that with lowering the gamma a bit and see if we get a shadow that's just looking a little more gracefully like kind of what we want here. And of course this is completely objective. This is where you could go find some reference and see, what it should look like. It would be really helpful if something else on this beach was casting a shadow from above, so we know. It's the kind of thing you can also walk away and decide what you want to do. But either way, what I really wanted was also just the subtlety happening in these shadows. And so yeah, I think this was a case of just fighting with the element a little bit. And so sometimes it's better to step back and see what you got and how you can use it without kind of kludging it. There's one more thing I want to carefully point out here, and it's because of the red flag of this mask being animated out here to hold out these two guys. Now, I looked a little more closely, and this pre-comp is actually that special import you can do with a LayerDXR, where you get a composition that automatically has everything all set up for you in pre-comps. And so this student started out with this, but it's worth bearing in mind that in addition to some of the passes that I mentioned earlier, there are also these functional ones, and those include the object buffers. So here is an alpha channel, and here's another one. And there is my mat to get rid of the creatures from the other scene. So I realized that we were kind of drinking from the fire hose a little bit with this one, and there are quite a few variables. I'm hoping that in this review we've narrowed those down a little bit, and I've shown you just some of the basic ways in which you could successfully use what you've got here, and a couple of these ways where you might overlook things that you can make use of.